All right. It looks like everyone's people will start to filter in, but we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. Good morning. My name is Dr. Roman De Jesus. I'm a Earth Science professor here at Fullerton College. And Dr. Ruben Lopez and I want to welcome you to the Fullerton College Earth Day Symposium on fossil fuel divestment and climate action. So today we're going to have two speakers. We'll give them introductions first, but right now I'm going to go ahead and kind of give you the format. So today's is a webinar format. If you have questions, we will go ahead and you please use the Q&A icon at the bottom to ask questions for our speakers. And at the end of today, our two speakers will give presentations about 30 minutes. And at the end, we will go ahead and field some of the Q&As for the audience. Now, Ruben, would you like to go ahead and take it away?
Sure. Again, welcome everybody to our annual now 2022 Earth Day Symposium here at Fullerton College. Before we begin our program, we'd like to acknowledge, let me share my screen very quickly. We'd like to acknowledge the land on who we sit or where we sit. And it is customary now to acknowledge our predecessors here on this land. Fullerton College is located on the unceded ancestral lands shared by the Gabrielino Tongva Nation and the Wanyanyo Band of Mission Indians, a Hashiman Nation, who have been the traditional caretakers since time immemorial. From the water defenders stopping the building of the Keystone XL pipeline to the Waorani peoples protesting deforestation, the Peruvian Amazon, Native communities across the globe continue to fight for and protect the environment, and they have continued to pay a heavy toll. A report released by Global Witness last year counted 227 environmental activists killed in 2020, an undercount, as this number relies on a level of transparency, freedom of press, and civil rights in individual countries. Indigenous communities make up only about 5% of the world's population, yet they bear the brunt of anti-activist violence. And in last year's count, they suffered roughly a third of those activists killed fighting for the environment. In California, Native communities are vital in helping to train firefighting agencies in more effective wildland firefighting techniques, extremely important these days as climate change and drought is having more of an extensive hold on California and fires are becoming worse. Moving away from fire suppression and using more traditional prescribed burns to protect California communities. We still have much to learn from their accumulated knowledge. And a quick background just on Earth Day, as we are in the 52nd anniversary of the original Earth Day. Earth Day began as a direct response to the fossil fuel industry damaging the California coast. On January 28, 1969, a massive oil spill occurred off the coast of Santa Barbara, 3 to 4 million gallons of oil spread out over 35 miles, and it's still ranked as one of the worst oil spills in California history. The environmental movement existed before 1969, but it was fragmented and without a focused identity. Santa Barbara caught the focus of the nation and tapped into several societal energies swirling around environmental concerns, civil rights, and protests against Americans' involvement in Vietnam. 20 million Americans, 1,500 colleges and universities, and 10,000 schools participated in Earth Day 1970, focused more on activism rather than a celebration that is really associated with Earth Day today. This political wave in 1970 helped to create support for the creation of the EPA in 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, the creation of the California Coastal Commission in 1972, and the California Environmental Quality Act in 1970, among other pieces of important environmental legislation. Unfortunately, 52 years after Santa Barbara, progress on some environmental issues, especially those related to climate change, seem to have stagnated. With that, let me invite Professor De Jesus to give an update on where we are currently in terms of climate change before introducing our keynote speakers.
Thanks. So in 2015, 193 parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change ratified the Paris Agreement. And this acknowledged that each of these parties acknowledge the importance of limiting global climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius above average. And so they promised to reduce greenhouse emissions with 5-year commitments renewed by the participating parties. Now, according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, global warming reaching 1.5 degrees in the near term in the next few decades or so would cause unavoidable increases in multiple climate hazards and present multiple risks to ecosystems and humans. More importantly, if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius in the coming decades, or even later, many human and natural systems will face additional severe risks compared to remaining below that 1.5 degree threshold. So currently, our average global temperature is about 1 degree Celsius above the average from 1850 to 1900, or pre-industrial times. And we currently in the atmosphere have about 420 ppm of atmospheric CO2 compared to about 300 before during pre-industrial times. Now, to put that into context, if no additional CO2 was added to the atmosphere, there would stand about a 15% chance that Earth's temperature would stabilize at 1.5 degrees Celsius or below. So the amount of atmospheric CO2 currently clearly poses a problem, even if we were to stop all emissions now. Now, the IPCC in the past year or so has released its regular report, the AR6. So this is the 6th report since the beginning of the UNFCCC in 1992, and they boldly stated that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and that widespread changes in the atmosphere, ocean, and biosphere have already occurred. Now, this this warming influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years, and actually represents the warmest period in probably more than 100,000 years. So, as you can imagine, this warming has not been seen by human civilization at all. All right. So to give you a couple of examples of some of the things that the IPCC has also written about, kind of the impacts and some of the mitigation strategies. More recently, the working groups have released their reports in both February and earlier this month, and they conclude that more frequent and intense extreme weather events can cause large impacts related to nature and human society, and this is all beyond the natural climate variability. So this requires some development and adaptation efforts to occur. Now, the vulnerability of people to climate change differs substantially both within different regions as well as globally. And a large part of this, as we might hear today, is driven by patterns of socioeconomic development, different land and ocean use, historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism and different types of government. And this includes about 3.5 billion people who are at risk to climate change. So this is about half the world's population is vulnerable in this way. All right, and so so the IPCC has also provided some guiding models for potentially how to mitigate or reduce the impacts of climate change. And one of the models states that if we were to peak greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2025, we would certainly be able to limit global warming or the warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, with very little chance that we would go over that. But however, this assumes that immediate action will be taken by local and regional governments to eliminate greenhouse gases. And that so far has not been the case. And so that means without strengthening any of these policies, by the end of, perhaps by mid-decade, greenhouse gases are projected to continue to rise beyond 2025, and potentially leading to a warming of at least 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, that 3 degrees Celsius is twice the limit agreed to in the Paris Agreement, and could cause potentially catastrophic impacts on both natural systems as well as different human and social systems. Other strategies include, other than reducing greenhouse gases, is transitioning away from fossil fuels, carbon capture and sequestration strategies, that is removing CO2 as it comes out of the tailpipes or even smokestacks, and actually removing carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. However, these technologies are still not where we want them to be, and therefore are very likely to play a very small role in the near term. And so one of the other things that the IPCC highlighted is that the continued installation of fossil fuel infrastructure will essentially lock in future greenhouse gas emissions. And so therefore, if we were to hit peak greenhouse gas emissions and then lower them, we need to basically significantly stop our fossil fuel infrastructure building, and instead transition into alternative types of energy. All right, so that gives us a good segue into kind of why fossil fuels, the role that fossil fuels play in our, not just in our economy, but also in our energy sectors. And so the 2 speakers today will focus on what fossil fuel divestment means, and how that will contribute to climate action. All right, so our first speaker, Antonio Huez, is a leading energy and climate author and investigative journalist. An award-winning writer. By her bylines include Rolling Stone, Harper's Magazine, Newsweek, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Atlantic, CNN.com, The Nation, The Advocate, The Guardian, and many more. Antonia is the author of 3 books: Black Tide, The Tyranny of Oil, and The Bush Agenda. And so she's going to be our first speaker. And so we'll give Antonia 30 minutes. And then our second speaker, Tom Sanzillo, is the Director of Finance for the Institute of Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis. He is the author of several studies on coal plants, rate impacts, and credit analyses, and the public and private financial structures for the energy industry. So when Antonia is done, we'll transition to Tom. And at this point, Antonia, I'll leave it to you.
Well, thank you so much, Roman and Ruben, for that excellent introduction. And Tom, great to see you. Looking forward to your talk. And thank you to Fullerton for having us both today. It's really an incredible moment in history to be having this critical conversation. And I'm thrilled to spend this Earth Day with you and everyone joining us today. So thank you for being with us. As was touched on in my introduction, to a large degree, I've spent the bulk of my career researching, writing, and reporting from the communities on the front lines of fossil fuels and the climate crisis. And I currently teach a course at Tulane University in New Orleans, where I am, called Fossil Fuels and the Climate Crisis. I've traveled from Afghanistan to the Ecuadorian Amazon, from the tip of the Alaskan Arctic to the bottom of the ocean in the Alvin submarine at the site of the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. I've been on oil-soaked beaches across the Gulf and across California, to France covering the signing of the Paris Climate Accord, to the protests led by water protectors against the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline, which you saw. I've covered the Waorani, which you also saw in the introduction, and many, many other places in between covering this story. Yet in preparing for this talk, it was really my more formative years that have been dominating my thoughts. And that's from when I was in high school in the 1980s in Boulder, Colorado. And I had two main extracurricular activities. The first was working on the student newspaper, and the second was as founder of the Amnesty International chapter at our school. Both of these led me to join the effort underway at the time, trying to push the University of Colorado, which was just up the hill from our school, to divest from any businesses supporting the South African apartheid regime. It was a profoundly successful global movement and incredibly monumental in my life to have been a part of. It not only undermined the apartheid regime's financial support, but also any semblance of moral legitimacy to those who continue to support it. I've been thinking a lot about that today. I've also been thinking about another anniversary that takes place today, not just the Earth Day anniversary, but also that of the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. It's the worst offshore drilling oil spill in history. It took place just miles from where I'm sitting right now. And it's an ongoing crisis that I've been reporting on for over a decade, and about which I wrote a book called Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill. It's shaped a great deal of my understanding of the fossil fuel industry and also those communities impacted by it. I think most importantly, as I've studied the ongoing impacts of the disaster and have been in some ways embedded within these communities for so long, this is also one of the areas that's one of the birthplaces of the fossil fuel industry. And what I've learned is that for as long as there's been an industry, there have been communities on the front lines who have been resisting it, offering alternatives to it, and often living and engaging in those sustainable solutions to it. But very often these are marginalized communities, marginalized in a number of ways. And their ideas, the effects, their suggestions, their studies, their offerings have often been ignored and marginalized as well. One of the things that's changing, I think, right now in the climate crisis, in the climate movement, in addressing the climate crisis, is a much greater appreciation and growing appreciation of the knowledge and necessity of fronting those frontline communities. And even in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which was mentioned in our introduction, it highlighted that we cannot confront the climate crisis without putting that experience and expertise of frontline communities in the forefront in coming up with understanding the impacts of the crisis, but most importantly, those solutions that they've been working on and living for at least 150 years since the fossil fuel industry began, but much, much longer than that, with indigenous and frontline communities thriving well before the fossil fuel industry came along. So it's within that context that I want to speak with you about why on Earth Day, the conversation that we're having in confronting the climate crisis is a conversation that centers on fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry, and why divestment from fossil fuels has come to play such a key role in the climate movement. And really, Tom is the one who's going to center in on the divestment conversation. I'm going to sort of set the stage for him in talking about fossil fuels. But as I said, in my career, I keep track quite a bit and report on what communities are doing in addressing fossil fuels. So I actually thought I would start us off by sharing a clip that I saw this morning. And I'm going to share my screen. I think that should be all set up for me to do that. Right here from Twitter, with an action that was taking place with a protest at a Citibank in New York. And the protest is targeting Citibank's financial support of the fossil fuel industry for fueling the climate crisis. So they are blockading the inside of the Citibank in this protest. So that shows us the timeliness of what we're talking about right there this morning. And then I'm going to go into my presentation, which, let's see, is it going to show? I want to see myself. That's right. You can see that I'm talking. Hopefully that, if someone can let me know if that looks good on the screen right now.
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay, great. And sorry, just so I can see, are you seeing my slide or are you also seeing our images superimposed on top of it?
Depending on how people have their video set up or their screen set up, but I can see both you and the newspaper front page.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, great. I'm taking us back to the 80s again. I like to start off with this New York Times cover article, which is from June 1988. New York Times lays out the problem. The problem is global warming, lays out what action needs to be taken. And that's a sharp cut in burning of fossil fuels. Pretty straightforward, pretty much where we still are today. Okay, it's not letting me move forward. Okay, so why do we talk about fossil fuels? And I think this just often needs to be restated, that fossil fuels are the primary source of greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions of several important greenhouse gases that result from human activity have increased substantially since large-scale industrialization began in the mid-1800s. Most of these human-caused anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions were carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. The imbalance between greenhouse gas emissions and the ability for natural processes to absorb those emissions has resulted in a continued increase in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, which result in global warming. Fossil fuels are the largest source of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the world. The fossil fuel industry and its products accounted for 91% of global industrial greenhouse gases in 2015 and 70% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. These are the other emissions, and it's important to look at these because the primary source is greenhouse gas emissions. The primary source is fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels. These are the others, but almost all of the others also involve fossil fuels. So there's methane, which of course I hope we all increasingly know, one of the largest sources of which is oil and natural gas operations, and that methane is now being recognized as incredibly important for us to tackle in addressing the climate crisis. That methane emissions can be, depending on what scale you're looking at, 20 to 80 times more harmful to the climate than is even CO2. But also looking at nitrous oxide, one of the other sources is burning of fossil fuels. That basically, when we're looking at all of these emissions that are destroying our climate, fossil fuels are found at the heart of almost every single one. And that in 2019, fossil fuels were the source of 80% of US primary energy consumption, 94% of total US carbon dioxide emissions, and 80% of total US greenhouse gas emissions resulting from human activity. For this reason, the International Energy Agency, when it set out its net zero by 2020 report, the three front and center items for 2020 is the first one, and then 2021 were the second two. No new sales of fossil fuel boilers, but we won't go into that. But the two that we're going to focus on: no new unabated coal plants and no new oil and gas fields approved for development. No new coal mines or mine extensions. And the central focus of this finding, which they then elaborate on in their report, is that there should be no new investments in fossil fuel operations moving forward. And this is to get to their timeline. Basically, you cannot make progress on getting to net zero without starting by halting new investments in fossil fuel operations. And then just to center us in the differential impacts that both Roman and Ruben addressed. And I think it's important just to say this at the outset when we're talking about solutions. and reminding us what environmental and climate justice means. So environmental and climate justice are addressing environmental racism and climate racism. And the point is, without racism, societies would be unable or less able to offload environmental and climate costs to others. Those activities, oil production, polluting operations, et cetera, would not take place, or at least they'd be better regulated. And there would be no climate crisis, or greater action would be taken to make necessary changes to confront it. So that addressing racism is key to solving the climate crisis, and confronting environmental and climate racism and injustice is central to how we confront the climate crisis. Now, we are building on responses. So the International Energy Agency report, which says no new investments in new oil and gas or coal operations, and the IPCC findings that Roman and Ruben addressed, is getting to this idea that that oil and gas and coal essentially need to, or are going to end up being kept in the ground. And that's building off of these local resistance movements that I've talked about that have been making this same demand for some time. These are protests in Ecuador. These are photographs that I've taken from San Francisco to New York. This is Paris. This is San Francisco. This is New York. This is the New York People's Climate March. That this is a long-term, long-going demand that movements have made. And then this is also reflected in the finance sector. So this is a quote from Sarah Bloom Raskin, the former Federal Reserve Governor and former Deputy Secretary of the US Treasury. Even in the short term, fossil fuels are a terrible investment. It also forestalls the inevitable decline of an industry that can no longer sustain itself. And she's also responding in this statement to, again, findings from international agencies saying we basically cannot confront the climate crisis if we keep investing in fossil fuels. So she's saying, you know, this is just a bad deal to keep going in. But then there's the effect on human rights and the effect of the climate crisis on human rights. And I think this is a very important space to talk about when we're talking about divestment, because the United Nations Human Rights Council report on climate change and poverty by the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights back in 2019, and these findings have been reiterated each year, found that addressing climate change will require a fundamental shift in the global economy, decoupling improvements in economic well-being from fossil fuel emissions. Essentially, to move forward on the rights granted for human rights, you have to move away from fossil fuels. And then, particularly when we're talking about divestment, it's important to look at the findings because the industry has found a lot of success in putting the problem of fossil fuel consumption on consumers and trying to shift away from responsibility to itself. And this report found that since 1988, more than half of all global industrial greenhouse gas emissions can be traced to just 25 fossil fuel companies. And these are the 25. So you can actually trace where the emissions are coming from and who's doing them. And so you can look at each individual company on this list and see what their individual contribution has been to the climate crisis. And as this again says, more than half can all be put on these relative handful of companies. And this information, which if I was looking at my presenter view, I could cite the report from you and I'll share it if anyone wants to know. It's in my notes in the presenter view. This information has been used in a lot of really important ways, including a very important recent court ruling that again is important within this context of divestment. What's the role of individual companies and the idea of financially continuing to support them? So in this ruling just last year, the Hague District Court found in Mille Defense et al. V. Royal Dutch Shell, one of the basis of its court finding was that research that I showed before. And the court essentially found that Dutch law upholds the right to basic guaranteed human rights. And it found that Shell Oil Company, violated these rights due to its fossil fuel operations. And the reason why is because those operations are worsening climate change, and worsening climate change harms many fundamental human rights. And the court ordered Shell to reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030. And it said that basically that's going to most likely require that it shift away from those fundamental operations of burning fossil fuels. And I reported on this for Rolling Stone, and Michael Berger, executive director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, said to me of the court's ruling, "This is the first time that a court of law has drawn a clear connection between a fossil fuel company's basic business model, the production and sale of fossil fuels, and the threat to human rights that results from climate change impacts, and then directed the company to do something about it." Really importantly within these findings is that the court lays out how Shell knew, and this is reflecting on something that there's been, I think, more coverage of with respect to Exxon. And I'm going to talk about Exxon actually really quickly, even though you're looking at this slide about Shell, which is that back in the 70s and 80s, Exxon and Shell were conducting research which demonstrated to them that the burning of fossil fuels would alter the climate, and that it would do so in a way that was harmful. And then the companies then responded in different ways to that information. Exxon, again, of which there's been a lot of attention, very specifically took that information, decided not to share it with the public, and instead became a very aggressive funder of the climate denialist movement, putting forward public statements itself, questioning the reality of climate change, but then funding other groups that very directly said climate change isn't a problem, and we don't need to do anything about it. And Exxon, through a lot of investigations of Exxon, it's been demonstrated that Exxon's concern was that it didn't want regulation. It didn't want to be regulated to have to rein in those fossil fuel operations. And so it funded this denialist movement. And many of us believe that funding, along with other companies and groups like the American Petroleum Institute, put us probably back decades in trying to confront climate change, because so many in the public believed this misinformation. They felt, and the media had a huge role in this, that there was this sense that there was a debate among scientists that maybe climate change is real, maybe it's not. And so the media felt like it had to present both sides of an argument that we have since learned was never there, that the scientific consensus had always held that the burning of fossil fuels causes climate change to great harm. And in fact, both Exxon and Shell and other companies were aware of that as well. But that lack of public certainty reduced public pressure on policymakers to put in place regulations, which was exactly the end goal that the companies had hoped. And in this court ruling, the court actually looks at what Shell knew when, and then finds, again, this is more evidence that they knew about the harms of fossil fuels and the impact on climate change, that they were aware of it. But then the court basically finds that Shell simultaneously increased statements to the public and shareholders, acknowledging the recognition of the dangers of its products, different from Exxon in this case, pledged investments in renewables and reductions in emissions, but instead, essentially while simultaneously, it invested aggressively in operations which dramatically increased its fossil fuel operations and greenhouse gas emissions. So the court basically found that Shell's policy and intentions and ambitions Shell's stated intent that it has invested in renewable energy, did invest in renewable energy, will continue to do that. The court found that these amounted to intangible, undefined, and non-binding plans, and that therefore the court was required, and the court found that Shell's policies and operations run contrary to the rights guaranteed to the citizens of the Netherlands, which Shell has acknowledged and is obligated to uphold, and that Shell therefore was being required by the court to cut its emissions almost by half by 2030. And this finding is incredibly important because the court also says that Shell isn't alone, that other oil companies are likely going to need to be held to account as well. But the fact that Shell isn't alone doesn't absolve Shell from its legal obligation. And it's also important because the court is also calling out Shell and saying, even though you've stated that you understand this crisis, and even though you've stated that you're going to invest in renewables, you're not doing it. And the only way to make you change your policies is we're going to have to order you to do so. And by the way, Shell is challenging this ruling. But it's also had an effect. Immediately after this ruling, Shell has started to divest from fossil fuel operations, noting that was the necessary judgment that it can't be invested in fossil fuels. And so I want to just bring this right to where we are right now in the public conversation about the role of fossil fuels in the current crisis in Ukraine. So this was a protest that was held in Germany. It is for Ukraine and calling on the end of fossil fuels as a way of stopping the war. And immediately after the war began, we started to see a really important focus on what it means to still be dependent on fossil fuels at the time of war. And so Svetlana Kraskokova, Ukraine's representative to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said this: human-induced climate change and the war in Ukraine have the same roots, fossil fuels, and our dependence on them. This was a protest by a Ukrainian where he basically was evacuating from Kyiv, and he was still participating in the climate strike, the Friday climate strikes at the same time. And this was a post that he put on Twitter. He said, "I was fighting against climate crisis. Now I'm fleeing a war caused by fossil fuels." And then this is United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking about the Ukraine war. And he said, "As current events make all too clear, our continued reliance on fossil fuels makes the global economy and energy security vulnerable to geopolitical shocks and crises. Now is the time to accelerate the energy transition." And President Biden, "The US must transition to clean energy. That'll mean tyrants like Putin won't be able to use fossil fuels as weapons against other nations." And editorial boards across the world, this is the Financial Times, said that Europe must end its Russian energy habit. War in Ukraine has strengthened the case for alternatives to fossil fuels. The Los Angeles Times is on the right, and their editorial said, "What's better than a ban on Russian oil imports? Ending our dependence on fossil fuels." And this is where I'm wrapping up, which is my latest article, which is in Zeek magazine. And what this looks at is sustainable solutions to the climate crisis. And it takes us back to where I began, which is that communities on the front lines of fossil fuels and the climate crisis have long been offering solutions. And those solutions are focused on moving away from large centralized forms of energy that are held and controlled by fossil fuel companies. They repeatedly tell me in interviews that I've conducted all over the world that they've seen what the fossil fuel companies have done when they've known about the crisis, when they've promised to shift to fossil fuels, when they've controlled energy, and they don't like what they've experienced or what they've seen. And then instead, the solution is moving to renewable sources of energy, but those that are localized, community owned, controlled by a local community, produced in a local community, shared by a local community, where you reduce the overall amount of energy that you're using because the energy source is so close to you, and you remove that power and control over it that control of fossil fuels gives to countries, gives to companies, and you remove that power element by localizing, distributing, communally owning sources of energy, and removing the companies essentially from the equation altogether. And divestment is certainly one of those strategies that communities have advocated for over and over again, which is to say, let's not put our money behind supporting these companies. Let's not put our money behind in supporting fossil fuels. Let's instead divest and redirect that money at supporting and funding those local communities that are now and have been struggling to create and implement those sustainable alternatives. So I will stop there and thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, Antonia. I have so many questions, but I'm going to go ahead and save some of those for our Q&A. I want to remind the attendees that you do have the Q&A option. You can type in the question, and if we can, we'll get to them. Otherwise, we will also answer them at the end of Tom's session. So thank you again. And it's all, I was surprised to hear that your activism started with the divestment of the South African apartheid. I really want to kind of come back to that a little bit later, but thanks. Ruben?
I can't remember. Are we doing the questions now or at the end of Tom?
Well, in the interest of time, I think we should go ahead and move to Tom.
I agree.
Yep.
I agree.
Yep. Okay.
Let me go ahead and then introduce Mr. Tom Sanzillo. Excuse me. Sorry, let's lost my. So, Tom Sanzillo is Director of Finance for the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. He is the author of several studies on coal plants, rate impacts, credit analyses, and public and private financial structures for the energy industry. Please give a warm welcome and please pay attention to what Mr. Sanzillo has to say. He's going to get the nuts and bolts of divestment. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, thank you, Ruben. I want to thank Antonia for that presentation. You were very modest in your presentation of your work. Antonia is, we don't talk much about this in the United States anymore, but we have public intellectuals. And Antonia is probably one of the most important public intellectuals that we have. And that presentation that you just witnessed is probably the best presentation I've ever seen on the climate. And you should take notes because this one isn't going to be as good. Anyway, I work for an organization called the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. We're in about 30 countries. And what we try to do in a practical matter is to support the fights that Antonia was talking about. And we do it with money and finance and energy economics. And we do it because we're experts and can make the case back to the oil and gas industry and the bankers and the financial infrastructure that is propping it up. I too wanted to start a while ago because gray hair is gray hair. And in the early 70s, I was a participant in those Earth Day celebrations. And it had a really important impact on me. I'll just talk about it for a minute. I was a young activist and was involved in anti-Vietnam War actions, voter mobilizations, housing rights and poverty and abortion rights. And it was largely organizing in what I would say was the dark side of humanity, injustice and war. And I lived in a neighborhood. I was first in my family to be educated. And I lived in a neighborhood in Brooklyn that was being ripped apart by racial violence. And I got to the point where I didn't know if I could continue. And I went to the first Earth Day celebration. I think it was the first or the second, I can't remember, but I was pretty young. And what I saw there that day was people talking about, clean air and clean water and green spaces and health. And that was not my political experience. It was on a much more difficult set of things. And I kind of came away there saying, this is what I need. If there were forces that were pulling me to this sort of dark side of humanity, these people here were my kindred spirits looking for a better way. And so I decided that was what I was going to be doing. And that was the Earth Day. I'm going to talk a little bit about later, but in my life, I gravitated to money and politics. And the question I've always had in the back of my mind is, how can all this money in the world be actually used for some good? And I believe that it can be. And so I keep pushing at it. Recently, the head of one of the most important investment houses in the world, BlackRock, he said, we focus on sustainability because we're environmentalists, not because we're environmentalists, but because we are capitalists and fiduciaries to our clients. When I first started doing this work about, 13 or 14 years ago, before that I was involved with money and finance. Until very recently, it was believed that the kind of investments we're talking about hurt profits. What Larry Fink from BlackRock is saying now is that the sustainable investments that Antonio was just talking about actually improves profits. And that is earth-shattering in terms of the perspective of the financial industry. But it's just some, and sometimes it's just superficial. And it's up to us to turn it into something real. So when I was asked to come talk today, I was thinking more about, besides going back to Earth Day, I've been thinking about what's been happening in the last number of years, because it's the war that I'm involved in every day. The climate movement's been asking governments and pension funds and insurance companies, endowments and foundations, and a host of corporations and institutions to pull out of fossil fuels. And these investment funds control trillions of dollars that provide money to every aspect of the economy, not just fossil fuels, but the pharmaceutical industry, the information technology industry, utilities, and the energy sector. And the energy sector is largely oil and gas and coal interests. So while at times it seems like these big investment funds, like they really have no relationship to oil and gas, actually they own them. And all of these funds own these companies through shares, stock, bonds, and other kinds of investments. And Antonia gave us very good political and moral arguments and why universities and pension funds and others should be divesting. And my goal here is to talk to you about why this makes sense from a money position, straight up money, profits, and how the economy is going to be growing. What I can say is that over the past few years, more funds, investment funds, and more big funds are moving away from fossil fuels. It's a trend worth understanding. It's particularly worth understanding in California. Last night, I attended a hearing in Sacramento debating a divestment bill. Your major pension funds in the state are saying they don't feel that they should be moving towards divestment, and there are a very large group of people in the state who feel otherwise, including hundreds of students who got on the phones last night to voice their opinions. And And I felt I was a former fund manager, just like the ones who are opposing of divestment here. And I spoke in favor of the bill to force them to divest. And as a former fund manager, I kind of felt a little bit sympathy for the pension fund people, because they actually know what they should be doing, and they're not doing it. And they should be divesting because it is sound investment strategy in 2022. So when thinking about why a pension fund or an endowment should divest from oil and gas stocks, you have to start with preconceptions and facts about the industry. And we have a view in this country that environmental protection and profits are in conflict. And if you hold that view, then if you divest from fossil fuels, you are essentially going to be harming your investment returns and your investment portfolio. The truth is that the environment and profit making don't have to be in conflict. They often are, and they don't have to be in conflict in the way they're in conflict. I have just a couple of slides, and I'm going to put one up. Let's see if I can do this. What happened to it? It's here just a minute ago. Okay, is that, can you see that? Okay. Yeah, can you
Yep.
see it now?
Yep,
Okay.
that's good.
Okay, and I'll just do this one. Anyway, so when it comes to divesting oil and gas stocks, what you find is that you'll be protecting the environment, and you're also going to be improving investment portfolios, and you may even produce higher returns. Now, I was involved in investing money for the governments of the city and state of New York for about 17 years. And I want to consider, I have one slide, and I'm just going to leave it here for a while, and then I have a little one that after this. This is the one substantive slide. In 1980, oil and gas stocks were 28% of the Standard & Poor's 500. That's 28% of the economy. That's like what Amazon and Google and all of those companies are, the information technology companies are today. That was oil and gas in the 1980s. They were a major contributor to financial markets in the world, and to the funds that I managed. Today, that line going all the way down, they are 3.7% of the stock market. That's you could argue anything you want to, but in my book, that's less, considerably less. And they lost market share because it's simple, they're less profitable. And if you think about it, this means that investors are increasingly choosing stocks from other parts of the economy and not fossil fuels. So over the last 10 years or so, when you look at, there have been new kinds of investments, which are fossil-free investments. And over the last 10 years, those fossil-free investments made more money than the fossil-free investments with oil and gas companies. These are called indexes, and the indexes are groupings of stocks that are combined around a market theme or a strategy. And the largest funds try to capture the value of the entire economy, because over the long run, the economy usually grows. So you try to have everything in there, including fossil fuels. But what we've noticed over the last 10 years, as this downward trend is occurring, is that fossil fuels have actually driven down the overall profitability of the world economy. That's what happens when you're that big and you collapse. So they have been lagging the world economy and pulling down the rest of the market. Now, this isn't just me who sees this. The government of Norway is a very interesting and clear case for why we need to move from fossil fuels. Its economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas revenues. 25% of all government revenues and about 30% of the economy is from oil and gas. They own oil and gas. They drill for it. They buy it. I'm sorry, they sell it. And that their annual revenues are what closes their budget deficits and makes it possible for them to have an enormous surplus from 1990 till about 2015. And that enormous surplus turned into a $1 trillion a fund, which they are now going to be using, because since 2016, they have been publishing a chart. And that chart is showing that they will no longer be receiving oil and gas revenues sufficient to cover their deficit. They will no longer be receiving oil and gas revenues sufficient to build their fund anymore. They, in fact, have to draw from the fund. And they don't see this changing until 2050, because in 2050, they don't think they're going to have anything left at all. That is a view from a country and that is dependent on fossil fuels. Its advisors are the best advisors in the world on fossil fuels, or there might be some that are equal too, but there will be none better. I've advised the fund there. And they know they have to come up with a new economy. Now, these investments, this view is also true of Russia and Saudi Arabia, but Russia and Saudi Arabia are not transparent, and they don't tell their public what is going on, and they do other things in order to deal with it. Like today, the events in Ukraine show us perhaps the ugliest side of oil and gas. President Putin, Russia's leader, started a war in the Ukraine to recapture part of Russia that he feels was lost. His actions have also raised the price of oil to historically high levels. And oil is the most important source of money for Russia, even more important for Russia than it is for Norway. And Ukraine gives him control of major pipelines into Europe. And that's something that he now pays for and doesn't want to pay for anymore. But it also is doing something else. High oil prices are also how oil and gas companies like Exxon and Shell and other nations like Saudi Arabia make money. Right now, war and bloodshed is driving prices up where markets have been failing to do so for a decade. It is these kind of geopolitical actions that are going to be the way in which the fossil fuel industry organizes itself, because as I've been trying to say, it has no financial rationale anymore. So it's going to be about raw politics. And these facts tell us that the oil and gas stocks, once major contributors to world finance, are now incredibly shaky. BlackRock, the same firm I just talked about, performed a study for the city of New York. Its pension system asked BlackRock if they could divest from fossil fuels and still maintain their financial targets. They have retirees to take care of. One of the funds that I was involved, I was a manager of for many years. BlackRock's answer to them was, yes, you can divest, and yes, you can meet your financial targets. BlackRock is opposed to divestment as a policy. They are serving their clients who asks them about divestment. They tell them the truth, and they tell them, yeah, you can do this. In fact, when they did their analysis, they found out that of the many funds that had divested, that none of them did worse financially. Most of them did better, and some were neutral. But none of them lost money from getting out of fossil fuels. And of course, with a record like the screen I'm showing you, where they're just losing year after year after year, it's not a surprise that those were the findings. Those who argue that a fund will lose money, therefore, which are most of our oil and gas industry, are absolutely wrong. Oil and gas stocks have collapsed over time despite the current high oil and rising stock prices. In fact, right now, with the high oil prices, if I was still a fund administrator considering divestment, now's the time I would divest because you're going to make a lot of money doing it. And funds that have seen so-called losses from prior divestments like South Africa and tobacco, this was raised by the CalPERS and CalSTRS pension funds in your legislature yesterday. They are wrong about that. They are wrong because the fund managers themselves were able to continue to turn a profit for their investment funds. CalPERS and CalSTRS are some of the biggest funds in the country, and they're still saying, "Oh, we lost money on South African tobacco." I'm not even sure that's accurate, but it didn't hurt the fund at all. It means that sound financial planning. It means good analysis. It means a strategic approach to the markets should result in no losses and maybe even positive results from divestment. So when we talk to managers of funds like CalPERS and CalSTRS and even smaller ones, and I know there's some discussion at Fullerton around the Friends of Fullerton Fund, what we are saying, or what we are asking when we speak of divestment to fossil fuels is not that you should get out. The real question for the fund managers are, why are you in fossil fuels at all? And it's not a rhetorical question because they can't meet their own standards. What I've just outlined to you is a long train of losses, a small part of an investment portfolio, an industry with a negative outlook. And from a strictly financial perspective, as someone who manages a fund, why bother with them? Why bother at all? And it's this issue of a negative outlook I want to just spend a minute to make a point on. Oil and gas companies know they are the primary source of greenhouse gas emissions. They know they must pivot away from this line of business. So far, the best of them have made commitments. Others, like Exxon, are just all talk, and it's not true, whatever they say. The companies, however, continue to plan and spend, like Antonia said, on new drilling and improving output of oil and gas in the hopes that the markets turn around. And they lobby hard against climate change solutions because those usually would result in a smaller amount of oil and gas being used in the world and their role being substantially reduced. Well, I was responsible for a large pension fund, actually two of them, at an earlier part of my career. 1 million workers and their families were responsible for we were responsible for serving. The oil and gas sector performed really well, and they were the most important contributor to the fund I managed. This is no longer so. You cannot be romantic about business decisions. When an investment starts to fail, it's your responsibility to act. Divestment is a defensive financial move to protect funds from losses and the planet from future catastrophic, current and future catastrophic events. I also want to take a few minutes now and step back a little bit because we have been soundly criticized by the fossil fuel industry, and I want to respond to a couple of things that they have said. Antonia touched on a number of them, but I just want to develop it a little bit. One critique is that divestment will have little impact until consumers use less fossil fuels. No one denies that fossil fuels are part of everyday life, not only transportation, electricity, and home heating, but fossil fuels are also in plastics. And plastics are in our clothing, our computers, our carpets, our medical equipment, the bottles and cups that hold liquids we drink, the packages that bring food to our tables, the tables themselves, the plates and cookware, all either made principally of fossil fuels or preserved and protected by fossil fuel products. The divestment movement is part of the climate movement. And those of us in the climate movement are aware of the major economic transformation that is taking place as we speak. My organization, a week or so ago, came out with a study on wind and solar energy in the United States and showing it to be the fastest growing part of the energy sector. We're also watching as the auto industry around the world moves from internal combustion engines to electricity. These are indications that the fossil fuel sector is seeing competition that they've never seen before historically, and it's part of the reason why you're seeing the drop in their profitability. What we have today are two economies. One of them I'll call a fossil fuel economy, and one I'll call a green economy. They compete with each other every day. On the other hand, they cooperate and are the energy transition that you hear about. There's widespread job destruction, job and community destruction in the coal industry, for example. On the other hand, the green economy and energy is producing jobs, and it's producing jobs not only in the energy sector, but beyond that. But those changes in the rest of the economy that are going to need to take place as we decarbonize the economy are opportunities for enormous amounts of investments and more jobs. We talk about divestment and investment for a reason. Divestment is designed as a defensive move for funds as these broader changes are taking place. It's in furtherance of economic changes away from fossil fuels and towards a broad array of alternatives, which does also still include fossil fuels in the future, but in a much more limited range of functions in the economy. The debate over divestment is actually also a preparation of what needs to happen and what is happening. So do we need to change consumer habits? You bet. But the process is going to take place over time, and it is not a logical reason for not divesting. We've experienced major technological changes in our lifetimes, home phones to pay phones, to beepers and pages, to large cell phones, to pocket-sized cell phones, to who knows what's next. That's consumer behavior, technology, and markets all moving together. We can expect that same series of activities to wind its way through the economy with ever new ways of organizing the economy from inputs from people all over the world. And that's what we're looking at. Divestment in this sense is part and parcel of the very demands that those who are saying it'll only be when we change consumer demand, because increasingly those who consume financial services are saying they don't want to be in fossil fuels. And so that particular argument, it falls in terms of practical economics. It falls apart in terms of how technological change takes place, and it has no basis in how actual financial change takes place. Another criticism is that divestment is a breach of what we call the fiduciary duty of a fund trustee. When you get on a board, you have an obligation, and you have an obligation to use the assets of that fund to the benefit of the people. If you're a university trustee, it's for the students and the faculty and the community so that it functions well. Like me, I was a pension fund manager. I was responsible for making sure that we pay the retirement checks for our retirees. Those were our beneficiaries. That's who I was responsible to. And you have a duty of care and prudence, and it's called a fiduciary duty. And you have a responsibility to ensure that the actions that you take serve the beneficiaries. And a review of fossil fuel companies reveals several factors that fiduciaries must consider. First, are they making money, and are they likely to make money in the future? Second, are they identifying and managing risks, and is there a plan to manage risks? And third, given the philosophy, history, and mission of a fund, where would divestment fit in? And looking at the first two questions about making money and identifying risk, the answer is no. poor performance, financial performance by the industry, and the lack of preparation to address climate change is reason enough to meet the fiduciary test. Universities and many charitable organizations also have a higher bar. They are obligated in almost every state in the country to consider the investment in relationship to the mission of their institution. That's state law in every single state, I believe every state. Right now, several student organizations that we're involved with have filed complaints with their attorneys general in their home state, challenging university investments in fossil fuels on just this ground. That runs counter to this, to the intellectual traditions of our universities to be based in rational discussion, scientifically derived research, and sound concern for the community and the ethical basis for our actions. And no university is going to want to stand before an attorney general and be subjected to those kinds of questions. But that is what holding fossil fuel means. It should be considered contrary to every university fund in the nation and every charitable organization that has investments. So divestment is not contrary to fiduciary duty. There are 1,500 examples of institutions around the country that have done one form or another, have divested. The fiduciary argument being made by our opponents is completely wrong. And if you exercise good care and diligence in arriving at your decision, you run virtually no risk of being successfully challenged on that ground. And I was subjected to making fiduciary decisions for 17 years. I know a lot about it. I want to take a few more of their arguments in rapid fire, step up the pace here because I'm almost done. And another argument they're being made is divestment has no effect, except every major investment house in the world now has what's called an ESG investment funds, and almost every one of them have exclusion lists that include fossil fuel companies. If we have had no impact, it beats me how these people now see business interests in supporting funds that are divesting, because the public wants to see it, and they're making money from it, which is something to keep in mind. They say also taking money away from companies, fossil fuel companies, will only result in other investors buying the stock. Well, this chart that I'm showing you here, it shows you the opposite. And this is a fact. And when you have an industry that has 28% of the stock market and now it's less than 4%, that's called less buying of the stock. So it isn't true that if funds divest, someone else will just buy them. They're not. And they are also saying to us, if you divest, it's going to be very expensive, because there'll be fees and costs, and this, we're going to not be able to fund the tuition, and we're not going to be able to fund the pension funds where I am, except investment funds, the ones that I did, we bought and sold stock all the time. We have to. It's part of the process called rebalancing. And divestment, it's just another form of rebalancing. It shouldn't cost anything. And as more funds do it, any long-term maintenance can be spread across all the funds, and there's really no impact at all. But you'll hear that, and it just isn't factually correct. That it's misinformation, let's call it. And then they say funds will lose access to important money managers because the money managers are so responsible that they will boycott the investment funds who want to divest. When New York City put out a bid to see if they could divest, BlackRock and several other major investment firms competed for the business because they wanted the contract. And that's right now, divestment and ESG is a cottage industry within the money advisory world, and they are competing for the work to do it when funds ask them to do it. And so that too isn't, I could go on these because I deal with this almost every day. But I should return a little bit to the trends that are going on, and then I'll wrap up. Capital markets, despite what I'm talking to you about, are moving too slowly to deal with climate change. The slow movement a way gives us some hope. And as a sense, in one sense, the market is empowering the divestment movement. And on the other hand, the divestment movement is trying to empower the companies to support the people in those companies who are willing to push for fossil-free portfolios and to diminish investment capital going into the fossil-free sector. The question becomes like, why does this matter? And I'll finish up with that. At the state level here in California, where CalPERS and CalSTRS are pension funds, they're a very important part of your budget process. And when the pension funds flounder, taxes go up, and tough budget decisions need to get made. And we know that when tough budget decisions get made, higher education, healthcare, and rebuilding of the communities that don't have a lot of political muscle, low income and minority communities do not benefit in a situation like that. So when they are their decisions by CalPERS have very important budgetary implications. It's also important at the county level, where I know community colleges get a lot of their money, shrinking state budgets and weaker tax bases are detrimental to county budgets and to the kind of services that people rely upon. You don't want this kind of mess in your investment portfolios over time. You need to be able to get smooth, steady profits in order to keep that connection between the investment funds and our public dollars strong. Similarly, philanthropic investments used to support all kinds of activities, including higher ed, can't support students with tuition and capital programs for good buildings and up-to-date technology if they don't have the money. So the financial case I'm trying to make here for divestment is financially compelling. And I'll leave you with just a couple of thoughts about divestment and leadership. For the students, divestment campaigns are taking place all over the country. If you're interested to learn more, you can check out divestharvard.com or divestinvest.org. You can become involved. Your concern and your voice matters, and actually it means everything. Last night at that hearing, it was the students and other California residents that carried that vote, because those legislators saw that there were hundreds of people who went to some obscure committee, tucked away in Sacramento, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they showed up and they spoke out. And that was very important because the opposition was there and we outnumbered them, and that's what needs to be done. For the administrators who may be on this, listening to this, I was a public official. And what I signed up for was not what I got. And all of you know what that means. All of you know what it is to have to make choices based on poor information, a handful of difficult choices with lousy expected outcomes. It's kind of what you get when you get into public office. But climate is a difficult issue. It's unfair to the academics and the academic community to have to make climate policy with their fiduciary powers. You may not be wanting to do it, you may not be interested in it, but it is interested in you, and what you want is not what is needed. As university officials, you have an extra special challenge. The students are watching. They can tell leaders who act out of fear, arrogance, and selfishness, and they can also be inspired by leadership that is kind, resourceful, and humble. And I've seen this happen over and over again. Climate change and divestment touches all aspects of university life. The intellectual inquiry, ethical action, interest group conflict, as well as the mundane world of budgets, administration, and finance. Divestment, as with leadership, is an all things considered judgment. Finally, when I was sitting on the lawn at City Hall that Earth Day I spoke about before, there was a musician who played a song. His name was Richie Havens. And the song was "What You Gonna Do About Me." It's still worth a listen for everybody today. Thanks. Oh.
All right, thank you, Tom. So I think we can go ahead and address some of the questions that people have put in the Q&A. I believe Antonio has started to type some of them in. But Ruben, do you have anything specific that you would like to ask either of the panelists?
Not necessarily. I think we have some good questions in the Q&A that our students and other members of the community should have at least addressed a little bit here.
So one of the common things I'm seeing in the Q&A are kind of have to do with the alternative energy sector. And so, Antonio, if you wouldn't mind starting, could you give us a couple of examples of how, because you mentioned how local communities produce and distribute their own energy locally. So can you give us maybe an example or two of what you've seen as far as those alternatives go?
Yeah, and I guess to put it in the, and first, thank you, Tom, for that great presentation and the extremely kind words at the beginning. I really appreciate it. And Tom, of course, has been a source on my stories, and his work is fantastic. So it was a real treat to hear that presentation. So just what I would say is one example here in New Orleans, where I am, there's a big push towards community-owned solar projects, where that is, you have a localized solar farm that's either on land nearby or placed on people's homes and houses. That energy is owned and supported by that local community, and the energy it provides energy for the local community. And then anything that's excess goes back onto the grid. And this has been really important in New Orleans because when there are hurricanes and storms, the large centralized systems of energy get shut off and shut down. And if everything is centralized in one area, and the spokes that connect it out to the grid are shut down, then we are all shut off from energy, which we were in the wake of Hurricane Ida, in some examples for weeks and others for months. But the localized system of energy isn't harmed in the same way. It doesn't have the same tentacles that can be broken down and shut down. It's right there. And those communities continue to have their energy source. Moreover, actually, solar panels on roofs were found to protect roofs from storm damage. And what this means by localizing the energy source, because one of the questions was really important. It asked, do we have enough? Can renewable energy produce enough to replace fossil fuels? And what's really interesting is that fossil fuels now cost as much to produce as they did 150 years ago. The industry has not put more money into making itself more efficient. They've put more money into finding ever more expensive forms of energy. So they've gone to the deepest depths of the ocean, into the tar sands, into shale rock, and that's where their money has gone. Renewable energy instead has gotten 5 times, many more times than that, more efficient and more cost effective. So it's cheaper to consume each year. And also, when you use those localized forms of energy, the energy doesn't have to move as far, so you use less of it, because it doesn't have to, you don't have to also have that energy to move the energy to different locations. So basically, you need less energy when you replace fossil fuels with renewables. So it doesn't need to be a one-to-one, and you save money by shifting to the renewables because they're so much more efficient and effective.
Yeah, we're involved in Puerto Rico, and I've been for about 10 years. They went bankrupt and had all the storms, and they have to rebuild their energy grid. And the fossil fuel interests now, it's just like 2% of the energy system in Puerto Rico is renewable energy. The rest of it is diesel, oil, coal, and some natural gas. And it costs about $2.5 billion a year to pay for those fossil fuels, and the energy industry is down there, and they don't want to give up a nickel of it. And so we've been able, through organizing and kind of expertise that we do, to have the regulators say that we absolutely have to have more solar energy in massive amounts to deal with the reliability issues that Antonio was just talking about. And they're also in bankruptcy. So my job has been to deal with the financial aspects of this. They can't balance their budget unless they do renewable energy. It's that much. Right now, the price of electricity in Puerto Rico is between 25 and 30 cents a kilowatt hour. We can bring renewable energy into Puerto Rico for 9 cents a kilowatt hour. That's 1/3 the price. The politics of it is we're getting beaten at every step, and we just keep doing it, and we just keep fighting it. And I don't know where it's going to go. We're never going to give up. The people there are just not going to give up. But neither is the industry. I don't know what the ultimate outcome is. Between that and the Wall Street interests who are trying to wreck the bankruptcy plans so that the economy can work there, it's a fight. And we do that battle in other places in the world. In Indonesia, we've done it. The Philippines, it's almost the same battle to get rid of the fossil fuel interest. And as I said before, they don't have a financial rationale. They have a political rationale, and we have the financial rationale.
May I just add, sorry, Tom, really quick to jump on what you just said, and also in response to some of the questions. You know, one of the what I hear over and over again in local communities is that they have the ability to implement these solutions, but they don't have the resources. They don't get the same attention. And when we're talking about divestment and reinvestment, there's trillions of dollars circulating, investing in fossil fuels, and there is just a trickle, almost nothing, that goes to support these local sustainable community solutions all over the world. I was just had a presentation yesterday in my class from Amira Woods, the Institute for Policy Studies, who's an expert on Africa. She's from Liberia, and she just said there's example after example of example across the African continent, across Latin America, across the United States, of local communities that want to implement, simple rooftop solar in their communities, particularly rural communities. But the money that's going to finance even renewable energy is going towards large scale, technologically extremely complex, massive scale operations that haven't gotten off the ground because they're too expensive, too remote, too distant, when money could just go right now immediately to support the local communities. And so what we're talking about here isn't just divestment, it's where can that money be redirected to immediately benefit communities, but also, as Tom is saying, is a better return on investment in the end anyway.
Yeah, it sounds like, I don't know if this is a good characterization of what's happening, but like the democratization of energy at these local levels seems to be like a really good way forward, because a lot of people think that, these upfront costs are expensive for individuals, but if they're shared by the community, that seems like a much more efficient way, not just energy wise, but financially as well. So it makes sense that is a path forward.
Yeah, we did a thing in New York State. We were asked to design a program that would allow for mass expansion of rooftop solar for homeowners and tenants in the state. And we designed it, and then we figured out a way to finance it so that there was a sliding scale that the poorest people didn't have to pay a lot, if anything, and then to the more middle income people, where there would be a more of a lending, traditional kind of banking relationship. It works. The mechanisms are there. We're going to try to do the same kind of thing in Puerto Rico, and there are other places besides New York that are doing the same thing. You can do it at a mass scale, and it can be done. And I won't go into it, but there are ways to do this between the federal government, the state government, and the business community. And you do these trade-offs, is what they are. And it's better that than subsidizing the fossil fuel sector. And when you can build businesses, you're going to be building local businesses who are going to be bringing in the panels and bringing in the kind of energy efficiency things. In New York, we've created a couple of labor centers. The labor unions really didn't want these kinds of projects because they're too tiny, but the communities did. And so there are little labor centers that the business community started, and they're mostly run by women and African American and Puerto Rican and Chicano in New York, all over the state. They're there. I mean, they're small. The program isn't as well funded as it should be, but it could be. And this stuff can work, and it's going to create it's an economic change that looks positive in almost every way, and we need to adopt more of it. And we have answers. We have answers. The bigger systems, those electrical systems, in some places you need them, but you only need them after you've exhausted the lowest, least costly one investment, which is the rooftop solar. That's your cheapest form of investment. And once you maximize that, you may need bigger systems for hospitals, for whatever if you have a baseball stadiums and things like that, you may need larger systems. But industrial facilities. But even those don't have to be fossil fuel. I mean, Exxon is now buying solar energy, incidentally, to run their refineries in Texas. I thought that was quite amusing.
Well, thank you everybody for attending our symposium. We are out of time. Really quickly before we end our session, we did record the session, and we will make the link to this video conference available later on. So please keep an eye out for an announcement from Fulton College. Also, if our panelists are agreeable to it, we can also, as part of that email, post contact information if you're willing to answer maybe some of the questions that we did not get a chance to answer as our time ran out today. Just want to say thank you very much to both Antonia and Tom for sharing their expertise and their valuable time with us today. This will conclude our session for today. Thank you very much for attending.